Okay, hello. Welcome to video lecture number 11. I am Mr. Weber, AP US History. Today your lecture is titled The New Politics of Empire. We are going to cover four separate sections today. We're going to look at the rise of colonial assemblies, the idea of salutary neglect, protecting the mercantile system, and the American economic challenge. So before 1689, the English governments ruled most colonies with authoritarian statutes and in accordance with authoritarian principles. After the Glorious Revolution and Queen Anne's War, however, colonial assemblies gained greater autonomy from governors and royal placement. In addition, there was a growing colonial interest in defining political liberties, some of which were perceived by colonists as different from the deference and patronage of the English system of rule. European rivalries also affected the politics of empire in the colonies. The proximity of the Spanish in Florida, in particular, posed a threat to Southerners and the institution of slavery on which they depended. Okay, so let's look at this in more detail, starting with our first section, which is, of course, the rise of colonial assemblies. The triumph of the South Atlantic system changed the politics of empire. The British were content to rule the colonies with a gentle hand, and the colonists were in a position to challenge the rules of the mercantilist system. In England, the Glorious Revolution strengthened the powers of the commons at, of course, the expense of the crown. American representative assemblies also wished to limit the powers of the crown, and they gradually won control over taxation and local appointments. The rising power of the colonial assemblies created an elitist rather than a democratic political system. Neither elitist assemblies nor wealthy property owners could impose unpopular edicts on the people, however. Crowd actions were a regular part of political life in America, and they were used to enforce that community's values. By the 1750s, most colonies had representative political institutions that were responsive to political pressure and increasingly immune from British control. So let's take it further and look at our next section, which is salutary neglect. Salutary neglect, under which royal bureaucrats relaxed their supervision of internal colonial affairs, focusing instead on defense and trade, was a byproduct of the political system developed by Sir Robert Walpole, who was a British Whig. Radical Whigs argued that Walpole used patronage and bribery to create a strong court party. Landed gentlemen argued that Walpole's high taxes and bloated, incompetent royal bureaucracy threatened the liberties of the British people. Colonists, maintaining that royal governors likewise abused their patronage powers, tried to enhance the powers of these provincial representative assemblies. Okay, moving on then to protecting the mercantilist system. Walpole's main concern was to protect British commercial interests in America from the Spanish and from the French. Walpole arranged for Parliament to subsidize Georgia in order to protect the valuable rice colony of South Carolina. So it was kind of like a buffer state. Resisting British expansion into Georgia and growing trade with Mesoamerica, Spanish naval forces sparked an event known as the War of Jenkins' Ear in 1739. Walpole used this provocation to launch a predatory but largely unsuccessful war against Spain's American empire. The War of Jenkins' Ear became a part of the War of Austrian Succession from 1740 to 49, bringing, of course, a new threat from France. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 returned the French naval forces of Louisbourg to France after its capture by New England militiamen, but the treaty also reaffirmed British military superiority over Spain, effectively giving Georgia to the British. Okay, on to the last section, which is the American economic challenge. Colonial merchants took advantage of a loophole in the Navigation Acts that allowed Americans to own ships and transport goods. The loophole allowed colonists to cut dramatically into commerce in the Atlantic. The Molasses Act of 1733 placed a high tariff on imports of French molasses to make British molasses competitive, but sugar prices rose in the late 1730s, so the act was not enforced. The Currency Act of 1751 prevented colonies from establishing new land banks and prohibited the use of public currency to pay private debt. This was in response to abuse of the land bank system by some colonial assemblies that issued too much paper currency, that is, and then required merchants to accept the worthless paper as a legal tender. In the 1740s, British officials vowed to replace salutary neglect with rigorous imperial control. So this does conclude video lecture number 7. As always, address the review questions in your notes at the bottom and continue on to the reading if you haven't already done so.